motion is on the urgent need to seek domestication of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement by an act of the National Assembly prior to the implementation of the proposed visa on arrival for citizens of African countries as recently directed by the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria and the Nigerian-Immigration Service, NIS. The Senate of the Federal Republic of Nigeria notes that on the 12th of December 2019, it was reported by the Daily Trust newspaper that the Nigerian Immigration Service says that the federal government has approved that all Africans could come into Nigeria without visa from January 2020. Further notes that this visa on arrival VOA policy is in furtherance of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that was signed by Nigeria sometime during July 2019. Aware that both Section 12 of the 1999 Constitution of the Federal Republic of Nigeria as altered and the treaties making procedure, etc. Act 1993 requires that as a prerequisite, the National Assembly ought to enact legislation for the purpose of giving effect to all treaties after their ratification by the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria or other members of the executive arm of government of Nigeria. Concerned that neither the Federal Executive Council nor a member of the National Assembly has yet submitted to the National Assembly a bill for domestication to enable effect to be said African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is necessary prerequisite before its implementation. Therefore, it is premature, constitutionally and legally impossible for the provisions of the said agreement to have any effect within the territory of Nigeria. Cognizant that the National Assembly has not delegated its powers to enact legislation for domestication of international treaties and agreements as prescribed under Section 12 of the 1999 Constitution to either the President of the Federal Republic or to the Nigerian Immigration Service or to any other agency or official of the executive arm of government, observes that the Presidential Executive Directive and the Nigerian Immigration Service that all Africans could come to Nigeria without visa requires compliance with Section 12 of the 1999 Constitution. Worried that the national security of Nigeria in the context of the current insurgency and terrorist challenges of Boko Haram could be jeopardized if the said proposed 2020 visa on arrival policy of the NIS. Accordingly, the Senate resolves to invite the Comptroller General of the Nigerian Immigration Service, NIS, to appear before the Senate Committee on Interior, Judiciary and Legal Matters to inform the Senate on the technical, logistics, legal and constitutional issues that are available and required for compliance before the implementation of the said visa on arrival policy. 2, to invite the Attorney General of the Federation and the Honorable Minister of Justice to submit a copy of the executive bill on the said agreement and all the subsidiary legislations that to be published in the Federal Gazette within 2 weeks. Finally, the Senate Committees of Interior, Judiciary and Legal Matters to report back to the Senate ASAP, and for the Senate to transmit the above resolutions to the House of Representatives for concurrence. Mr. President, I so submit.
My good friend Adetumbi to support that this policy be domesticated. In fact, Mr. President, my colleagues, a lot of Nigerians were really worried. The reason for the worry was because of the spate of insecurity in Nigeria. And for us having known that part of the insecurity came from elements coming outside and into Nigeria, to now have a visa policy that doesn't seem to be properly regulated was giving people a lot of jitters, because what it now meant was that anybody could just come in and actually cause mayhem in Nigeria, not knowing this. So we really want to support Distinguished Senator Adetumbi in this particular motion that we domesticate it so that the do's and don'ts and cross the I's and dot the I's and cross the T's in how you can come into Nigeria. I know that Nigeria is the big brother of Africa, but sometimes if you try to be big brother when you don't have anything left, you may just find yourself with nothing. And we want to make sure that we take care of our citizens before we start taking care of the whole of Africa. And so I fully support this motion.
Senator,
who will now come with his, whenever, yes.
Seconder.
Rivers West Senatorial District. Mr. President, I'd like to take us back to when this African Free Trade Zone Treaty was to be signed and the reluctance of Nigeria not to sign this treaty. There are obviously a lot of reasons why we didn't sign this treaty. And when eventually the treaty was signed, this Senate debated extensively on this treaty and the need for the executive to immediately send the treaty to the Senate for domestication, or for us to even understand the document or the content of the treaty. The African Free Trade Zone Treaty is a treaty that will alter a lot of things in terms of the way we do business and Nigeria as a nation. And it is not a document I think we should take in piecemeals. And of course, again, in these days when we have situations where the government can take an executive order and just pass an executive order and things are done as per the executive order being as good as a law, it is dangerous for us to allow this process to continue. And I'd like to join my colleagues to commend the mover of this motion and to insist that the treaty, the entire document of the treaty be brought to the National Assembly for us to understand these documents and seek expertise advice on how to domesticate and, what we need to take out as portions of this treaty that may not be suitable for Nigeria. Thank you, Mr. President.
Is there anybody against the motion?
To that district. Mr. President, I rise to support my friend Senator Adetunji on this very important motion. Mr. President, I think it is necessary for us to state here that when international agreements are entered into by Nigeria, they should be properly domesticated to give it the bite of legality and legitimacy. Mr. President, I think the visa aspect of this agreement needs to be looked into very closely and critically. Mr. President, we are aware that in recent years, a part of Nigeria, Embakasi, was ceded to Cameroon, and up to this moment, as required by law, no act of the National Assembly has been enacted to give it some level of legality. And today our people out there are in a quandary as to where they belong. So, Mr. President, I support this need for domestication. But, Mr. President, I want to raise this very critical point before we begin to debate on what may not be at issue. There are two clear things here. There is visa on arrival, and Mr. President, there is free visa. What Mr. President said recently that I know is free visa for Africans to enter Nigeria. Mr. President, visa on arrival is a policy that has been employed by the Nigerian Immigration Service since 2012. And that means that if for whatever reason you are unable to get visa from your country of origin, you can fill the necessary forms and get to the airport or port of entry and get your visa. And so clearly, Mr. President, what we are debating here is free entry visa for Africans as announced by Mr. President. And again, I think as part of the African Free Trade Arrangement, it needs an act of the National Assembly to back it up. I think we should take steps to do that. Thank you, Mr. President.
Cited, who is the sponsor of this very important motion, that all that needs to be done in terms of legislation should be done before implementing this very, very commendable policy. This is part of what is happening, globally. It's what is in vogue, particularly countries that want to open their doors to investors. and tourists. Saudi Arabia is beginning to operate this kind of policy. We've seen Dubai. Dubai has been, having this kind of policy, and you see how tourists go into Dubai. So several countries, it's what's in vogue now. It's what is in vogue. So while looking at the security angle, we should also remind ourselves that it's important we go in line with what is happening globally. Other countries are doing it, and they are gaining a lot in terms of business influence to those countries. Also, tourist influence to those countries. So we should look at this perspective as well. Senator Amoson has emphasized that. So that's what I want to emphasize. It's a commendable policy. We should embrace it while making sure that all legislations that will allow that to be put in place should be, done. I so submit.
Senator Kwame.
Supporting this motion. Mr. President, what this motion is trying to do is just to perfect what Mr. President has done. Clearly, Mr. President, since we have signed the AFTA, which I think was signed eventually towards the tail end of maybe June or July, I think the next thing to do is to domesticate it. But in that domestication, if the law-making body, as represented by the National Assembly, both the Senate and the Rep, if they do not look into the law itself, given vent to the presidential approval that has been given for visa on arrival, then all of us as a nation will be just open to what I call anybody just coming into this nation. Of course, this what we signed guarantees the free movement of persons. But in doing that, we, the lawmakers, must be given the opportunity to look into it and try to fine-tune gray areas. Because without doing it, there's nothing wrong with Mr. President going out there and saying something on behalf of all of us. But clearly, before it is perfected, the National Assembly should play its part, particularly those treaties that require legislation. So, Mr. President, without bedeviling this issue, I want to strongly support that we quickly ask the executive to bring a bill so that we can actually support the initiative that they are trying to put in place. This will aid trade, it will aid commerce, it will aid our economy, and by extension, Nigeria will be further developed. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Borojibu.
Was going to observe, but you say there is no observation in our rules. You allow him to continue because he was trying to adumbrate the motion, which our rules does not allow. So I was going to raise that what I was doing was not necessarily correct, but that is gone. Mr. President, let me join the mover of this motion and say that for me, Mr. President made a policy statement within the context of African head of state. I don't think that was intended to say that this policy was going to be implemented without the necessary amendment, because if we look at the Immigration Act, it is stated clearly the method of coming into this country. You must have visa before you come. We don't have a policy that allow us or allow other internationals to come into this country, get visa on arrival. So we must necessarily, as National Assembly, saddle with that responsibility, legislate on that before it is implemented. Otherwise, so I don't think it is any problem. He made a policy statement. It is now incumbent on him, as Mr. President, to also direct the necessary authorities. Let them bring the Immigration Act here for us to amend. When we amend it, we will now be able to input properly what we need to do and how that policy will be carried out. So for me, it's a policy meeting within the African head of state, and he feels that let us relax a little bit. It must and have to be legislated. And so I think his motion is in order, and that Mr. President should be urged to quickly send in the amendment to the Immigration Act so that we'll properly take the necessary action on it. I saw some.
Senator Bikule Amos, point of order. Continue, Senator Surajudi.
Section 3 made categorization of the kind of treaties, and the category 1 is what is referred to as law-making treaties, and these are defined to be being agreements constituting rules which govern interstate relationship and cooperation in any area of endeavor, and which have the effect of altering or modifying existing legislation, or which affect the legislative powers of the National Assembly. The nature of the treaty that the subject matter of the motion is a lawmaking treatise, and by subsection 2, paragraph A state that paragraph A of section 1 of the section need to be enacted into law. So it's a mandatory requirement that treaty of such nature should be enacted into law. And on that note, I second the motion ably moved by Senator Adetunbi of Ekiti. Thank you.
Minority Leader.
And just by way of adumbration, the motion is ably supported by Treaties Making Procedure ETC Act of 1983, particularly Section 3, which categorizes
Controller General of the Nigerian Immigration Service to appear before Senate Committee on Interior, Judiciary and Legal Matters to inform the Senate on the technical, logistics, legal and constitutional issues that are available and required for compliance before implementation of the said visa on arrival policy. Those in favor of this prayer say aye. Amendment, Minority Leader.
Yeah, I think the amendment
Interior instead of the Controller General. I so second.
Those in favor of prayer 1 as amended say aye. Those against say nay. The ayes have it. Prayer 2, to invite the Attorney General of the Federation and the Honorable Minister of Justice to submit a copy of an executive bill on the said agreement and other subsidiary legislation that are to be published in the Federal Gazette within 2 weeks. Those in favor of prayer 2 say aye. Those against say nay. Senator Adetunbi, please can you withdraw this prayer?
What is the prayer?
The will of the plenary.
On the prayer.
Which one is that?
So the third, I did the rule.
The President.
I only put the question. You still want it?
I will stand on prayer 1 and nothing more.
Thank you very much. So, distinguished colleague, thank you very much for the various interventions. I didn't want your end of your prayers killed. I also agree with the position of Senator Betty Apiafi. There are other treaties and agreements that we have signed as a country. I think the Attorney General of the Federation should be able to forward those to the National Assembly for us to ratify them appropriately and give them the legal backing that they require. Leader of the Senate.